My son ate some of that genetically modified corn, and he done swelled up just like his Aunt Margit on Thanksgiving.
Today we're going to talk about genetically modified crops with an emphasis on corn. Genetically modified food is a very controversial topic in genetics today. Many people believe it does harm to the body, while others believe it does no harm and helps society by increasing production and decreasing crop deaths due to disease, parasites, and viruses. Genetically modified crops are still fairly new and the long-term effects are largely unknown. Today, researchers still continue to genetically modify crops as the resulting crop is usually more profitable. In supermarkets, genetically modified foods are becoming much more common, as well as organic products, which were grown naturally. We will start this introduction by branching off to genetically modified crops by looking at the differences between varieties of one crop in particular. Modern-day corn, the extra sweet variety for example, its wild ancestor, Teosinte, and its intermediate, the Native American cultivated Hopi variety. And yes, these jokes are corny. We will be focusing on the genetic variations of these varieties of corn, as well as the genotypic and phenotypic differences. Teosinte, the wild ancestor of all corn, is phenotypically very different than modern-day variety corn. The cob is very small, hardly recognizable, and the plant overall is much smaller than the corn we know today. Its intermediate, Hopi, has a visibly larger cob and slightly larger leaf area, but both are smaller than modern-day variety corn, which has a significantly larger cob and leaf area. Teosinte also has much more gene diversity than the other varieties. Some of the theories to why Teosinte is more genetically diverse includes geographic isolation and a bottleneck effect that took place after thousands of years of artificial selection. Some research suggests that the differences of leaf area could indicate that the different varieties of corn are spending their resources differently, with modern-day corn focusing mostly on producing a larger cob, which humans have selected for thousands of years. Teosinte is also thought to have a quantitative trait loci, which codes it for it to produce many branches. So over time, it seems that corn crops were selected for genes that coded for larger cobs, larger leaves, and taller and less branched stalks. Today, corn is even genetically modified at the molecular level, with disease and virus-resistant stains of DNA being selected for. So what is genetically modified? Let's leave the topic of corn now and get to the root of the problem here. What exactly is genetically modified? Genetically modified food is food that has artificially altered proteins and genes that were transferred from one type of organism to another artificially to obtain a desired effect. Bernstein, a scientist, also notes that in most cases, only minute amounts of a protein needs to be expressed to obtain the desired trait.
I'm Dr. Bernstein. My colleagues and I have found that genetically modified corn being fed to cows can be transferred to the stomachs of humans. So we ran some double-blind sided tests with two groups of people who had contact with the corn. A half of the group we had with the genetically modified corn, and the other half was with the organic corn. So we found by the end of the experiment there was no significant difference between the number of allergic reactions between both groups. And we then concluded that there was no solid evidence that we found that indicates that genetically modified corn is more allergenic, toxic, or even less nutritive than organic corn.
People in general do not like or trust food that is genetically modified. A survey done even showed that they'd be willing to pay more money for organic, even though when observing their actual purchases, they found that people still bought the cheaper, genetically modified food anyway. They also found that people underestimated how much genetically modified food they really eat. So what are the rewards of genetically modified corn? Why do we do this? Armyworms and earwigs are two parasites that prey on corn. A study was done to observe if a certain strain of genetically modified corn was able to resist attacks from those parasites, and the results were compared to a control group of organic corn grown the same way. They found that the genetically modified corn strains suffered significantly less damage from parasites than the unmodified version. Clearly, some outstanding things can be achieved with growing genetically modified food, including corn. Genetically modifying corn risks and potential hazards. Many varieties of herbicide and pesticide-resistant genetically modifying corn are grown in today's agriculture. There are both great risks and great rewards to growing genetically modified corn. For example, growing genetically modified corn can help protect against attacks from strains of viruses in plants and can potentially save thousands of crops, whereas an organic farm of corn could succumb to the same virus and most of the corn would die or become inedible. There are also many risks, however. Not much is known about the risks of what genetically modified food does to the human body over time, or even generations. Even less is known about the long-term effects of genetically modified food on long generations of people and their health risks and risks of certain disease. So when the double blindsided test was done and neither side knew that they were eating genetically modified, the reactions were actually about the same to organic, which makes sense. Long-term effects of genetically modified crops. There is one study done on long-term effects. It was done by Espen Marcello and Santa Maria, and they observed that the effects of genetically modified crops over a 30-year period of time since the first genetically modified plants were made. They argue that there was an unjustified criticism of genetically modified crops and that the growing world population meant that they needed to find new ways to keep up with the growing demand for food to feed the population, or at least to keep the deaths of crops from disease and viruses down. They also argue that genetically modified crops have been cutting down on pollution caused by pesticides and other chemicals used to keep back pests and bacteria. So
Dr. Espen, do you believe that genetically modified crops are causing more harm than good? Well, I believe that genetically modified crops are a huge benefit to society. The world population is exponentially growing, and we need to find new ways to feed everyone. We found that genetically modified foods are helping to reduce the amount of crops that die on farms due to parasites, disease, and bacteria.
A study was done by Elson Hadi to observe how common genetically modified foods were becoming across the globe and focused their research on Saudi Arabia food products. They used quantitative and qualitative DNA-based methods to detect the foods and samples around different markets in Saudi Arabia. Out of 200 samples, they found that 44% of the samples contained maize had genetically modified food, as well as 26% of the soybean samples also having genetically modified foods in them. All of their samples that contained rice actually didn't have any strains of genetically modified food, however. It seems that the use of genetically modified foods is slowly spreading across the globe, but it may be a while until it loses its negative stigma. Many people are hesitant to accept them because they are so new and hard to understand, but in all of the studies done, genetically modified foods have shown to be very helpful and not very many negative side effects. Maybe a few decades from now, when genetically modified foods become a norm in agriculture, it'll be praised instead of criticized.